The Nazi officer in the front row was watching her too closely. Audrey could feel his eyes tracking every movement, every spin, every extension of her arms as she danced across the makeshift stage in the bombed-out building that served as their theater. She was 15 years old, 5'6", 87 pounds, so malnourished that her bones showed through her skin like a diagram in an anatomy textbook. But she kept dancing, kept smiling, kept her eyes focused on the middle distance like her mother had taught her. Never look directly at them, never let them see you're afraid. The music swelled. Beethoven. The Germans always requested Beethoven. She moved into the final sequence. Pirouette, arabesque, and then, as she spun, she saw it. The small piece of paper, folded into a tiny square, exactly where it was supposed to be, tucked into the crack between the floorboards at stage left. This was the dangerous part, the part where everything could go wrong, where 45 years of silence could end in a mass grave. She danced toward it, made it look natural, made it look like the choreography, and in one fluid motion, as she dropped into a curtsy at the end of the performance, she swept her hand across the floor and palmed the paper, hid it in her shoe, stood up, smiled at the Nazi officers who were applauding politely, and walked off stage with intelligence that could save 20 lives or end hers. She wouldn't know which until tonight. This is the story Audrey Hepburn never told. For 45 years, through 25 films, through an Oscar, through fame that made her one of the most recognizable women in the world, through countless interviews where journalists asked about her childhood in Holland during the war. She smiled. She gave vague answers. She talked about the hunger, the fear, the occupation. But she never mentioned this. Never mentioned the black performances, the secret messages, the time she carried intelligence for the Dutch resistance with Nazi soldiers watching her dance. Never mentioned that she was a spy. At 15 years old, when most girls were worried about school and boys and growing up, she was worried about whether the message hidden in her shoe would be discovered during a random search, whether the next performance would be her last, whether the families counting on her would die because she'd made a mistake. She stayed silent, for decades, until 1989. When finally, for reasons we'll understand by the end of this story, she spoke. And what she revealed changed everything we thought we knew about Audrey Hepburn. But let's go back. Back to how a 15-year-old girl ends up dancing for Nazis while smuggling intelligence for the resistance. September 1944, the Netherlands, 5 years into German occupation. The situation is desperate. The famous Dutch famine, the hunger winter, is beginning. Food is running out. People are starving. The Nazis are tightening their grip. Anyone suspected of resistance, activity is shot. No trials, no mercy, just execution. Audrey Rustin, not yet using the stage name Hepburn, lives with her mother in Arnhem. Her father abandoned the family years ago. Her 2 half-brothers have been taken by the Germans, forced labor in Berlin. She doesn't know if they're alive. Her uncle has been executed, shot in the street as a warning to others. They're starving. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, is a baroness. But titles mean nothing when you're eating tulip bulbs to survive, when you're burning furniture to stay warm, when you watch your daughter's hair fall out from malnutrition. Audrey has one skill, one thing that might keep them alive. She can dance. She's been training since she was 5. Ballet, classical, she's good, really good. Good enough that people will pay to watch her, even in a war zone, even when they're starving, maybe especially then, because people need beauty when everything else is horror. So she performs, in bombed-out buildings, in makeshift theaters, in basements and warehouses, wherever they can set up a stage. Her mother plays piano. Audrey dances. People pay what little they have. A few coins, a bit of bread, anything to see something beautiful, to remember that humanity still exists. The Germans allow these performances. They call them cultural activities, entertainment for the troops, a way to maintain morale. The occupation authorities issue permits. As long as you're not openly political, you can perform. It's one of the few ways to earn money, to survive. But someone sees potential in these performances, potential for something else. His name was never recorded, not in any official document, not in any history book. Audrey never revealed it. 45 years later, when she finally spoke, she still protected his identity, called him a family friend. Someone who knew they could trust her mother. Trust her. He approached them quietly, after a performance, in the shadows, spoke in careful whispers. "The performances," he said. "They're valuable, but they could be more valuable." Ella stiffened, pulled Audrey closer. This was dangerous talk, the kind that got people killed. "We need ways to move information," he continued. "The Germans watch everyone, search everyone. But dancers performing for them, with proper permits, they barely look at you. You're entertainment. Harmless." "My daughter is 15 years old," Ella said. I know what I'm asking. She's a child. There are no children anymore. There are only survivors and casualties. Right now she's surviving. I'm trying to keep it that way. For her. For all of us." Audrey spoke before her mother could refuse. "What would I have to do?" Over the next several months, the pattern developed. The system that would save lives and nearly cost Audrey hers. They called them black performances. Secret shows, not the official ones with German permits. These happened in hidden locations, basements, attics, barns outside, town. Wherever the resistance could gather without being detected. The audience wasn't German officers. It was Dutch patriots, resistance fighters, underground network members, people who were risking everything to fight back against the occupation. And the performances weren't just entertainment. They were intelligence exchanges. Here's how it worked. Audrey would perform at an official show, a German-approved event. Sometimes Nazi officers would be in the audience. Sometimes they'd request specific pieces. They loved classical ballet. Loved pretending they were cultured, civilized, not monsters running an occupation. During these performances, members of the resistance would be present. Disguised as ordinary audience members, they'd leave messages, hidden in specific locations, tucked into cracks in the floorboards, under chairs, behind loose bricks, always at predetermined spots that only Audrey knew about. She'd retrieve the messages during her performance, make it look like natural movement, like choreography, the sweep of an arm, the bend of a curtsy, the spin of a pirouette, each movement potentially covering the transfer of information that could save lives. Then, later that night, or the next day, she'd perform at a black performance for the resistance, and she'd pass the information along, sometimes in person, sometimes hidden in her shoes, sometimes sewn into the hem of her costume. The intelligence varied: troop movements, supply routes, names of collaborators, plans for raids, lists of people about to be arrested. Each piece of paper she carried could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of people. And she was 15 years old, 87 pounds. So weak from hunger that she could barely walk some days. But she kept dancing, kept carrying messages, kept playing her part in the resistance. There were close calls, too many to count. Times when Nazi soldiers inspected her costume. Times when they questioned why she was traveling between towns. Times when they almost searched the right place at the right moment. One night, a patrol stopped her. She had 3 messages hidden in her ballet shoes, lists of names, resistance members who needed to be evacuated before a planned raid. "Papers," the soldier demanded. Her hands shook as she handed them over. The soldier studied her documents, looked at her skeletal frame, her worn ballet slippers. For a moment she was certain he'd make her remove them, certain this was the end. Then he handed back her papers. "Go, 10 minutes before curfew." She walked 4 blocks, turned the corner, collapsed in an alley, shaking, then delivered the messages. 23 people evacuated that night. All survived the war. The worst period was winter 1944-1945, the hunger winter. The hunger winter. The famine that killed over 20,000 Dutch citizens. When they'd already eaten the tulip bulbs, already burned the furniture, already exhausted every source of food. Audrey's weight dropped to 82 pounds, Her hair fell out in clumps. Her skin was gray. Her periods stopped. Her body was shutting down, eating itself, trying to survive. But she kept performing, kept carrying messages, because stopping meant admitting defeat, meant letting the Nazis win, meant the deaths of people counting on her would be for nothing. Her mother begged her to stop. "You'll die. You're killing yourself. People are counting on me. If I stop, they die. At least this way, my dying means something." In February 1945, she collapsed. Her body gave out. The resistance doctor was blunt. "Another month and she'll die. Her organs are failing." They made her rest for 3 weeks, but she couldn't stop thinking about the messages not being passed, the people who might die. In March, she started again. Against all advice. She danced. She carried messages. She kept going. And then, in May 1945, it was over. The Germans surrendered. The occupation ended. The war in Europe was over. Audrey survived. Barely. She weighed 78 pounds. She had respiratory problems that would plague her for life. She had anemia. She had psychological scars she'd never fully heal from. But she survived. She was 16 years old, and she'd survived a war. Here's what she didn't do after the war. She didn't talk about what she'd done, didn't seek recognition, didn't tell stories. When people asked about the occupation, she gave vague answers, talked about the hunger, the fear, the waiting for liberation, never mentioned the black performances, the messages, the Nazi officers watching her dance while she smuggled intelligence right under their noses, never mentioned the times she came within seconds of being discovered, being executed. Why? Why 45 years of silence? "Because I survived," she said in 1989. "And so many didn't. The people who recruited me, the people I carried messages for, the families we saved. So many of them didn't make it. They were caught, executed, died in camps, died of starvation. And I became famous. I became Audrey Hepburn." How do you talk about being a spy when you're standing at the Oscars? How do you mention carrying resistance messages when you're promoting breakfast at Tiffany's? It felt wrong. It felt like I was using their sacrifice for my own glory. In 1989, a Dutch journalist confronted her with evidence. Old resistance records, names. A young dancer. She was 60 years old. 5 decades of silence. Finally, she spoke. "Yes, I did some work with the resistance, dance performances, carrying messages, once or twice a week for 6 months. Why now, after 45 years? Because I'm working with UNICEF, with children in war zones. They need to know resistance is possible, that you can survive, that sometimes the most important thing is just to keep dancing, keep being human when everything tries to make you less than human." The interview was published. Other journalists picked it up. Suddenly, the story was everywhere. Audrey Hepburn, spy. Audrey Hepburn, resistance fighter. Audrey Hepburn, war hero. She hated the attention. Hated being called a hero. "I'm not a hero," she said in a follow-up interview. "Heroes are the people who died, the people who kept fighting even when they knew it would cost them everything. I just danced. That's all. I danced and I delivered messages and I survived. The survival is what matters, not the heroism." But here's what she didn't say publicly, what she only told her sons, what Sean Hepburn Farrer revealed after her death. She carried guilt for 45 years, survivor's guilt. The family friend who recruited her, caught in 1945, shot 2 weeks before liberation. The resistance members she worked with, most of them dead, executed, starved, killed in the final brutal months of the war, and she'd survived. She'd become famous. She'd become comfortable. She'd become safe, while they stayed dead, while their families mourned them, while their names faded from memory. That's why she never spoke. Not because she was modest, not because she didn't think it was important, but because she felt like speaking about it would be profiting from their deaths, like she'd be turning their sacrifice into her story, her glory. But by 1989, she'd started to see it differently. through her UNICEF work, through meeting young people in war zones who needed to know that resistance was possible, that survival was possible, that you could live through horror and come out the other side still human. They needed to know, she told Sean, the children I was working with. They needed to know that I understood, that I wasn't just a rich actress pretending to care, that I'd been where they were, that I'd survived, and that the survival mattered more than the suffering. When Audrey died in 1993, tributes came from the Netherlands, from families of resistance fighters, from people who'd never spoken because she hadn't. One woman wrote, "My grandmother worked with Audrey, a young dancer who risked everything. That dancer carried messages that saved my grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, me. I exist because Audrey Hepburn danced for Nazis while smuggling intelligence." Another, "My father was scheduled for execution. A message warned him. 24 hours before the raid. He escaped, survived, had children, had grandchildren. We didn't know who until 1989. My father cried. That was her, the dancer. She saved my life." Dozens of stories, hundreds, families who existed because she'd risked everything at 15. Sean Hepburn Ferrer compiled them, published some in his book about his mother, and in the introduction, he wrote something that captures who Audrey really was. "My mother didn't see herself as a hero," he wrote. "She saw herself as someone who'd been given a chance to help and had taken it. She saw herself as lucky. Lucky to have survived. Lucky to have had the ability to dance well enough that the Nazis wanted to watch her. Lucky that she'd been able to use that luck to save others. She never understood that what she did was extraordinary. To her, it was just what anyone would do. What anyone should do. Use what you have to help who you can. Dance for the Nazis if it saves a life. Smile through terror if it means someone else lives." That was her philosophy. Not heroism, just humanity. Just doing what needed to be done because you could. That's the real legacy of Audrey Hepburn's Dutch resistance work. Not the spycraft, not the danger, not the near misses, but the understanding that resistance doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like dancing. Sometimes it looks like smiling at your enemy while smuggling their secrets. Sometimes it looks like a 15-year-old girl who weighed 87 pounds choosing to risk everything because someone had to, and she could. She was 15 years old. She was starving. She was terrified. And she danced. For 45 years, that was enough. The survival, the silence, the memory of what she'd done and who she'd saved. But in the end, she spoke. Because other 15-year-olds in other war zones needed to know. Needed to understand that you can resist. You can survive. You can matter even when you're small and scared and certain you'll die. That's what Audrey Hepburn learned at 15. What she carried for 45 years. What she finally shared because the world needed to hear it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep dancing.